While they were eating, Nadia said thoughtfully, "Tolia preferred boiled potatoes to fried." "Tomorrow," said Lyudmila, "he had been 19 years and 7 months old." That evening she remarked, "How upset Marussia would have been if she had known about the fascist atrocities at Yasnaya Polyana." Soon Alexandra Vladimirovna came in from a meeting at the factory. "What splendid weather, Vitya," she said to Victor as he helped her off with her coat. "The air's dry and frosty, like vodka, as your mother used to say." And if she liked the sauerkraut, Victor recalled, she used to say, "It's like grapes." Life went on like an iceberg floating through the sea. The underwater part, gliding through the cold and the darkness, supported the upper part, which reflected the waves, breathed, listened to the water splashing. Young people in families they knew were accepted as research students, completed their dissertations, fell in love, married, but there was always an undertone of sorrow beneath the lively talk and the celebrations. When Victor heard that someone he knew had been killed at the front, it was as though some particle of life inside him had died, as though some colour had faded amid the hubbub of life. The dead man's voice still made itself heard. The time Victor was bound to, spiritually and intellectually, was a terrible one that spared neither women nor children. It had already killed 2 women in his own family, and 1 young man, a mere boy. Often Victor thought of the 2 lines of Mandelstam which he had once heard from Madyarov, a historian who was a relative of Sokolov's. "The wolf-hound century leaps at my shoulders, but I'm no wolf by blood." But this was his own time. He lived in it, and we'd be bound to it even after his death. Victor's work was still going badly. His experiments, which he had begun long before the war, failed to yield the predicted results. There was something absurd and discouraging about the chaos of the data and the sheer obstinacy with which they contradicted the theory. At first Victor was convinced that the reason for these failures lay in his unsatisfactory working conditions and the lack of new apparatus. He was continually irritated with his laboratory assistants, thinking that they devoted too little energy to their work and were too easily distracted by trivia. However, his troubles did not really stem from the fact that the bright, charming, and talented Savostyanov was constantly scheming to obtain more ration coupons for vodka, nor from the fact that the omniscient Markov gave lectures during working hours, or else spent his time explaining just what rations this or that academician received, and how this academician's rations were shared out between his 2 previous wives and his present wife, nor from Anna Naumovna's habit of recounting all her dealings with her landlady in insufferable detail. On the contrary, Savostyanov's mind was still clear and lively. Markov still delighted Victor in his own calm logic, the breadth of his knowledge, and the artistry with which he set up the most sophisticated experiments. Anna Naumovna lived in a cold, dilapidated little cubbyhole, but worked with a superhuman conscientiousness and dedication. And of course Victor was still proud to have Sokolov as a collaborator. Greater rigour in the execution of the experiments, stricter controls, the recalibration of the instruments, all these failed to introduce any clarity. Chaos had erupted into the study of the organic salts of heavy metals when exposed to fierce radiation. Sometimes this particle of salt appeared to Victor in the guise of an obscene, crazy dwarf, a red-faced dwarf with a hat over one ear, twisting and writhing indecently as he made obscene gestures at the stern countenance of the theory. The theory had been elaborated by physicists of international fame. In mathematics, its mathematics were flawless. The decades of experimental data from the most renowned laboratories of England and Germany fitted comfortably into its framework. Shortly before the war, an experiment had been set up in Cambridge with the aim of confirming, in certain extreme conditions, the behaviour of particles predicted by the theory. The success of this experiment was the theory's most brilliant triumph. To Victor, it seemed as exalted and poetic as the experiment on relativity, which confirmed the predicted deviation of a ray of light from a star passing through the sun's gravitational field. Any attack on this theory was quite unthinkable. It'd be like a soldier trying to rip the gold braid off a field marshal's shoulders. Meanwhile, the dwarf carried on with his obscene foolery. Not long before Ludmilla had set off for Saratov, Victor had thought that it might be possible to expand the framework of the theory, even though this necessitated two arbitrary hypotheses and considerable further complication of the mathematics. The new equations related to the branch of mathematics which Sokolov's particular speciality. Victor wasn't sure of himself in this area and asked for Sokolov's help. Sokolov managed fairly quickly to extrapolate new equations for the expanded theory. The matter now seemed settled. The experimental data no longer contradicted the theory. Delighted with his success, Victor congratulated Sokolov. Sokolov, in turn, congratulated Victor. But the anxiety and dissatisfaction still remained. Victor's depression soon returned. "I've noticed, Pyotr Lavrentievich," he said to Sokolov, "that I get into a bad mood whenever I see Lyudmila darning stockings in the evening. It reminds me of the two of us. What we've done is patch up the theory, and very clumsily at that, using different coloured wools." He worried away at his doubts like someone scratching a scab. Fortunately, he was incapable of deceiving himself, knowing instinctively that self-consolation could lead only to defeat. The expansion of the theory had been quite valueless. Now the theory had been patched up, it had lost its inner harmony. The arbitrary hypotheses deprived of any independent strength and vitality, and the equations had become almost too cumbersome to work with. It had somehow become rigid, anemic, almost Talmudic. It was as though it no longer had any live muscle. A new series of experiments, carried out by the brilliant Markov, then contradicted the new equations. To explain this contradiction, he'd have to resort to yet another arbitrary hypothesis. Once again, he'd have to shore up the theory with splinters of wood and old matchsticks. "It's a botched job," he said to himself. Victor knew all too well that he was following the wrong path. A letter came from the Urals. The factory was busy with orders for military equipment, and the work of casting and machining the apparatus, ordered by Strum, would have to be postponed for 6 to 8 weeks. This letter didn't upset Victor. He no longer expected the arrival of the new apparatus to change anything. Now and again, however, he would be seized with a furious desire to get his hands on the apparatus as soon as possible, just to convince himself once and for all that the theory was hopelessly and irrevocably contradicted by the new data. The failure of his work seemed to be linked to his personal sorrows. Everything had become grey and hopeless. For weeks on end he'd feel depressed and irritable. At times like these he became uncharacteristically interested in the housekeeping, repeatedly interfering and expressing astonishment at how much Lyudmila spent. He even took an interest in the quarrel between Lyudmila and their landlady. The landlady was demanding additional rent for the use of the woodshed. "Well," he had asked, "how are the negotiations with Nina Matveevna?" After hearing Lyudmila through, he'd say, "What a mean old bitch." Now he no longer thought about the link between science and people's lives, about whether science was a joy or a sorrow. Only a master, a conqueror, can think about such questions, and he was just a bungling apprentice. He felt as though he'd never again be able to work as he had before. His talent for research had been crushed by his sorrows. He went through the names of great physicists, mathematicians, and writers whose most important work had been accomplished in their youth, and who had failed to achieve anything of note after the age of 35 or 40. Well, they at least had something to be proud of, whereas he would live out his life without having accomplished anything at all worthy of memory. Evariste Galois, who had laid down the lines along which mathematics would develop for a whole century, had been killed at the age of 21. Einstein had published On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies at the age of 26. Hertz had died before he was 40. What an abyss lay between these men and Strum. Victor told Sokolov that he'd like to suspend their laboratory work for a while. Sokolov, however, had high expectations of the new apparatus and thought they should continue. Victor didn't even remember to tell him about the letter from the factory. Lyudmila never once asked Victor about his work, though he could see that she knew of his failure. She was indifferent to the most important thing in his life. But she had time for housework, for conversations with Maria Ivanovna, for her quarrels with the landlady, for sewing a dress for Nadia, for meetings with Postoev's wife. Victor felt bitter and angry with Lyudmila, quite failing to understand her true state of mind. Victor thought that his wife had returned to her habitual way of life. In fact, she was able to carry out these tasks precisely because they were habitual, and so placed no demands on her. She was able to cook noodle soup and talk about Nadia's boots simply because she had done this for years and years. Victor failed to see that she was only going through the motions, not truly entering into her previous life. She was like someone deep in thought, who, quite without noticing them, skirts potholes and steps over puddles as he walks down a familiar road. In order to talk to her husband about his work, she would have needed new strength, new spiritual resources, and she didn't have this strength. Victor, however, thought that she had remained interested in everything except his work. He was also hurt by the way Lyudmila kept on bringing up occasions when he had been unkind to Tolya. It was as though she were drawing up the accounts between Tolya and his stepfather, and the balance was not in Victor's favour. Once Lyudmila said to her mother, "Poor boy, what a torment it was to him when he had spots all over his face. He even asked me to get some kind of cream from the beauty parlour, and Victor just teased him." And this was true. Victor had liked teasing Tolya. When Tolya came home and said hello to his stepfather, Victor used to look him up and down, shake his head, and say thoughtfully, "Well, brother, you have come out in stars." Recently, Victor had preferred not to stay at home in the evenings. Sometimes he went round to Postoev's to play chess or listen to music. Postoev's wife was quite a good pianist. Sometimes he called on Karimov, a new friend he had met here in Kazan. More often, though, he went to Sokolov's. He liked the Sokolov's little room. He liked the hospitable Maria Ivanovna and her welcoming smile. Above all, he enjoyed the conversations they had at table. But late at night, when he approached his front door, he was gripped by anguish, an anguish that had been lulled only for a moment. Instead of going home from the institute, Victor went straight to his new friend, Karimov. He was to pick him up and go to the Sokolovs. Karimov was an ugly man with a pockmarked face. His swarthy skin made his hair look still greyer, while his grey hair made his skin look still swarthier. He spoke Russian very correctly, and only the most attentive listener could detect his slight oddities of pronunciation and syntax. Victor had never heard his name before, but it appeared to be well known even outside Kazan. Karimov had translated the Divine Comedy and Gulliver's Travels into Tatar. At present he was working on the Iliad. At one time, before they'd been introduced, they often used to run into one another at the university, in the small smoking room on the way out of the reading room. The librarian, a loquacious, slovenly old woman who used a lot of lipstick, had already told Victor all about Karimov. He knew that Karimov had studied at the Sorbonne, that he had a dacha in the Crimea, and that he had formerly spent most of the year at the seaside. His wife and daughter had been caught in the Crimea by the war, and Karimov had had no news of them since. The old woman had hinted that Karimov had been through 8 years of great suffering, but Victor had only looked at her blankly. It was clear that the old woman had also told Karimov all about Victor. The two of them felt uneasy at knowing so much about each other without having been introduced, and when they did meet, they tended to frown rather than smile. Finally, they bumped into each other one day in the library cloakroom, simultaneously burst out laughing and began to talk. Victor didn't know whether Karimov enjoyed his conversation. He only knew that he himself enjoyed talking when Karimov was listening. He knew from experience that a man who seems intelligent and witty at first often proves terribly boring to talk to. There were people in whose presence Victor found it hard to say even one word. His voice would go wooden, and the conversation would become grey and colourless, as though they were both deaf mutes. There were people in whose presence even one sincere word sounded false. And there were old friends in whose presence he felt peculiarly alone. What was the reason for all this? Why is it that you occasionally meet someone, a travelling companion, the man sleeping next to you in a camp, someone who joins in a chance argument, in whose presence your inner world suddenly ceases to be mute and isolated? Victor and Karimov were walking side by side, talking away. Victor realized that there were times now when he didn't think of his work for hours on end, especially during these evening talks at the Sokolovs. He had never experienced this before. He normally thought about his work the whole time. In the tram, listening to music, eating, while he was drying his face after getting washed in the morning. Yes, he must have got himself into a blind alley. Now he was unconsciously pushing away any thought of his work. "How's your work gone today, Akhmet Osmanovich?" he asked. "Why, mine's gone quite blank. All I can think of is my wife and daughter. Sometimes I think that everything's all right and that we'll see each other again. Then I have a feeling that they're already dead." "I can understand," said Victor. "I know," said Karimov. How strange it all was. Here was someone Victor had known for only a few weeks, and he could talk to him about what he couldn't even talk about with his wife or his daughter. Almost every evening, people who would never have met in Moscow gathered together in the Sokolov small room. Sokolov, although outstandingly talented, always spoke in a rather pedantic way. No one would have guessed, from his smooth, polished speech, that his father was a vulgar fisherman. He was a kind, noble man, and yet there was something in his face that seemed sly and cruel. There were other respects in which Sokolov differed from the vulgar fishermen. He never drank, he hated draughts, and he was terrified of infection. He was constantly washing his hands, and he had cut the crust off a loaf of bread where he had touched it with his fingers. Victor was always amazed when he read Sokolov's work. How could a man think so boldly and elegantly? How could he elaborate and prove the most complex ideas with such concision? And then drone on so tediously over a cup of tea? Victor himself, like many people brought up in a cultured, bookish environment, enjoyed dropping phrases like "a load of crap" or "bullshit" into conversation. In the presence of a venerable academician, he'd refer to a shrewish female lecturer as an old cow, or even a bitch. Before the war, Sokolov had always refused to allow any discussion of politics. As soon as Victor even mentioned politics, Sokolov had either fallen into a reserved silence or else changed the subject with studied deliberateness. There was a strange streak of submissiveness in him, a passive acceptance of the terrible cruelties of collectivization and the year 1937. He seemed to accept the anger of the state as other people accept the anger of nature or the anger of God. Victor sometimes thought that Sokolov did believe in God, and that this faith showed itself in his work, in his personal relationships, and in his humble obedience before the mighty of this world. Sokolov's brother-in-law, the historian Madyarov, spoke calmly and unhurriedly. He never openly defended Trotsky or the senior Red Army officers who'd been shot as traitors to the motherland, but it was clear from the admiration with which he spoke of Krivoshchuk and Dubov, from the casual respect with which he mentioned the names of commissars and generals who had been liquidated in 1937, that he did not for one moment believe that Marshals Tukhachevsky, Blucher, and Yegorov, or Muralov, the commander of the Moscow military district, or Generals Lewandowski, Gamarnik, Gubenko, and Dubnov and Unschlicht, or Trotsky's first deputy, Skilansky, had ever really been enemies of the people and traitors to the motherland. No one had talked like this before the war. The might of the state had constructed a new past. It had made the Red Cavalry charge a second time. It had dismissed the genuine heroes of long past events and appointed new ones. The state had the power to replay events, to transform figures of granite and bronze, to alter speeches long since delivered, to change the faces in a news photograph. A new history had been written. Even people who had lived through those years had now had to relive them, transformed from brave men to cowards, from revolutionaries to foreign agents. Listening to Madyarov, however, it seemed clear that all this would give way to a more powerful logic, the logic of truth. All these men, he said, would have been fighting against fascism today. They'd have sacrificed their lives gladly. Why did they have to be killed? The landlord of the Sokolovs' flat was a chemical engineer from Kazan, Vladimir Rovanovich Artelev. Artelev's wife worked late. Their two sons were at the front. He himself was in charge of a workshop at the chemical factory. He was badly dressed, and he didn't even have a winter coat or fur hat. He had to wear a quilted jerkin under his raincoat, and he had a dirty, crumpled cap that he always pulled right down over his ears when he went out. When Victor saw him coming in, blowing on his numb red fingers, smiling shyly at the people round the table, he could hardly believe that this was the landlord. Rather than the head of a large workshop at an important factory, he seemed like some beggarly neighbour coming to scrounge. This evening, Artelev was hovering by the door, hollow-cheeked and unshaven, listening to Madyarov. He must have been afraid the floorboards would squeak if he walked right in. Maria Ivanovna whispered something in his ear on her way to the kitchen. He shook his head timidly, evidently saying he didn't want anything to eat. "Yesterday," said Madyarov, "a colonel who's here for medical treatment was telling me he has to appear before a party commission for hitting a lieutenant in the face. That sort of thing never happened during the Civil War." "But you said yourself that Shores had the members of the Revolutionary Military Commission whipped," said Victor. "Yes," said Madyarov, "but that was a subordinate whipping his superiors. That's a little different." "It's the same story in industry," said Artelev. "Our director addresses everyone in the familiar form, but he'd take offence if you addressed him as Comrade Shurev. No, it has to be Leonty Kuzmich. The other day in the workshop he got angry with one of the chemists, an old man. Shurev swore at him and said, 'You do as I say, or I'll give you a boot up the arse that will send you flying onto the street.' The old man's 71 years old." "And doesn't the trade union say anything?" asked Sokolov. "What's a trade union got to do with it?" asked Madyarov. "Their job's to exhort us to make sacrifices. You know, first we had to make preparations for the war, now it's everything for the front, and after the war we'll be called upon to remedy the consequences of the war. They haven't got time to bother with some old man." "Maybe we should have some tea now," Maria Ivanovna whispered to Sokolov. "Oh, yes, of course," said Sokolov. "Let's have some tea." It's amazing how silently she moves, thought Victor, gazing absent-mindedly at Maria Ivanovna's thin shoulders as she glided out through the half-open door to the kitchen. Yes, comrades, said Madyarov suddenly. Can you imagine what it's like to have freedom of the press? One quiet morning after the war, you open your newspaper, and instead of exultant editorials, instead of a letter addressed by some workers to the great Stalin, instead of articles about a brigade of steel workers who've done an extra day's work in honour of the elections to the Supreme Soviet, instead of stories about workers in the United States who are beginning the new year in a state of despondency, poverty, and growing unemployment, guess what you find? Information. Can you imagine a newspaper like that? A newspaper that provides information. You begin reading. There's an article about the bad harvest in the region of Kursk, the inspector's report on conditions inside Butyrka prison, a discussion about whether the White Sea Canal is really necessary or not, an account of how a worker called Goloputsov has spoken out against the imposition of a new state loan. In short, you learn everything that's happened in the country, good and bad harvests, outbursts of civic enthusiasm, and armed robberies, the opening of a new mine, an accident in another mine, a disagreement between Molotov and Malenkov, reports on the strike, that at the same time you continue to be a true Soviet citizen. You go into a bookshop and buy a book. You read historians, economists, philosophers, political correspondents from America, England and France. You can work out for yourself where these writers are mistaken. You're allowed out onto the street without your nanny. Just as Madyarov reached the end of his speech, Maria Ivanovna came in with a great pile of cups and saucers. And at the same moment, Sokolov banged on the table and said, "That's enough! I absolutely insist that you bring this conversation to an end." Maria Ivanovna's mouth dropped open as she stared at her husband. The cups and saucers she was carrying began to tinkle. Her hands were trembling. "There we are," said Victor. "Freedom of the press has been abolished by Pyotr Lavrentievich. We didn't enjoy it for long. It's a good thing Maria Ivanovna wasn't exposed to such seditious talk." "Our system," said Sokolov testily, "has demonstrated its strength. The bourgeois democracies have already collapsed." "Yes," said Victor. "But then in 1940 the degenerate bourgeois democracy of Finland came up against our centralism, and things didn't turn out too well for us. I'm no admirer of bourgeois democracy, but facts are facts. And what about that old chemist?" Victor looked round and saw Maria Ivanovna gazing at him very attentively. "It wasn't Finland, but the Finnish winter," said Sokolov. "Come on, Petya," said Madyarov. "We could say," Victor went on, "that during the war the Soviet state has demonstrated both its strengths and its weaknesses." "What weaknesses?" asked Sokolov. "Well," said Madyarov, "for a start, there are all the people who've been arrested when they could be fighting against the Germans. Why do you think we're fighting on the banks of the Volga?" "What's that got to do with the system?" "What on earth do you mean?" asked Victor. "I suppose you, Pyotr Lavrentievich, think that the corporal's widow shot herself in 1937. Once again Victor felt Maria Ivanovna's attentive gaze. He thought to himself that he had been behaving strangely in this argument. When Madyarov first began criticizing the state, he had argued against Madyarov. But when Sokolov had attacked Madyarov, he had begun arguing against Sokolov. Sokolov enjoyed the odd laugh at a stupid speech or an illiterate article, but his stance on any important issue was always steadfast and undeviating, whereas Madyarov certainly made no secret of his views. "You're attempting to explain our retreat in terms of the imperfections of the Soviet system," pronounced Sokolov. "But the blow struck against our country by the Germans was of such force that, in absorbing this blow, our state has demonstrated with absolute clarity not its weakness, but its strength. What you see is the shadow cast by a giant, and you say, 'Look, what a shadow!' You forget the giant himself. Our centralism is a social motor of truly immense power, capable of achieving miracles. It already has achieved miracles, and it will achieve more. If you're no use to the state, said Karimov, it will discard you. It will throw you out together with all your ideas, plans and achievements. But if your idea coincides with the interests of the state, then you'll be given a magic carpet. Well, that's true enough, said Artilev. I was once posted for a month to a factory of special military importance. Stalin himself knew about each new workshop that opened. He was in telephone contact with the director. And what equipment! Raw materials, special components, spare parts, everything just appeared, quite miraculously. And as for the living conditions, bathrooms, cream brought to the door every morning, I've never known anything like it. And a superb canteen, and above all, there was no bureaucracy. Everything could be organised without red tape. Or rather, added Karimov, the state bureaucracy, like the giant in a fairy tale, was placed at the service of the people. If such perfection has already been attained at factories of military importance, said Sokolov, then it will clearly eventually be attained throughout the whole of industry. No, said Madyarov. There are two distinct principles. Stalin doesn't build what people need. He builds what the state needs. It's the state, not the people, that needs heavy industry. And as for the White Sea Canal, that's no use to anyone. The needs of the state are one pole. People's needs are the other pole. These two poles are irreconcilable. Oh, you're right, said Artilev. Yet outside these special factories there's total chaos. People here in Kazan need a certain product, but according to the plan I have to deliver it to Chita. From there it's sent back to Kazan. I need fitters, but I haven't used up the funds allocated for children's nurseries, so what do? I put my fitters down in the books as childminders. We're stifled by centralism. Some inventor suggested a method of producing 1,500 articles, where we now produce 200. The director simply threw him out. The plan's calculated according to the total weight of what we produce. It's easier just to let things be. And if the whole factory comes to a standstill because of a shortage of some material that can be bought for 30 rubles, then he'll close the factory and lose 2 million rubles. He won't risk paying 30 rubles on the black market. Artilev looked round at his listeners, and as though afraid they wouldn't let him finish, went on hurriedly. A worker gets very little, but he does get paid according to his labour, whereas an engineer gets almost nothing. You can earn 5 times as much selling fizzy water on the street. And the factory directors and commissariats just go on repeating, the plan, the plan, the plan. It doesn't matter if you're dying of hunger, you must fulfil the plan. We had a director called Shmatkov, who was always shouting, the factory's more important than your own mother. Even if you work yourself to death, you must fulfil the plan, and if you don't, I'll work you to death yourself. And then one fine day we hear that Shmatkov's being transferred to Voskresensk. Afanasy Lukich, I ask him, how can you leave us like this? We're behind with the plan. He just said quite straightforwardly, well, we've got children living in Moscow, and Voskresensk is much closer. And then we've been offered a good flat with a garden. My wife's always getting ill, and she needs some fresh air. I'm amazed the state can trust people like that, while workers and famous scientists, if they're not party members, have to beg for their bread. Oh, it's quite simple, really, said Madyarov. These people have been entrusted with something far more important than factories and institutes. These people have been entrusted with the holy of holies, the heart, the life force of Soviet bureaucracy. I can truly say, Artilev continued, without acknowledging Madyarov's joke, that I love my workshop. And I work hard, I don't spare myself. But I lack the most important quality. I don't know how to work human beings to death. I can work myself to death, but not the workers. Everything Madyarov had said made sense, and yet, without understanding why, Victor still felt a need to contradict him. There's something twisted in your reasoning, he said. How can you deny that today the interests of the individual not only coincide with, but are one and the same as, the interests of the state? The state has built up the armaments industry. Surely one of us needs the guns, tanks and aeroplanes with which our sons and brothers have been armed. Absolutely, said Sokolov. Maria Ivanovna poured out the tea. The discussion turned to literature. Dostoevsky has been forgotten, said Mardyarov. He never gets reprinted, and the libraries try not to lend out his books. Because he's a reactionary, said Victor. That's true, said Sokolov. He shouldn't have written The Devils. Are you sure, Pyotr Lavrentievich, that he shouldn't have written The Devils? Inquired Victor. Perhaps it's the diary of a writer he shouldn't have written. You can't shave the edges off genius, said Mardyarov. Dostoevsky simply doesn't fit into our ideology. Not like Mayakovsky, who Stalin called the finest and most talented of our poets. Mayakovsky is the personification of the state, even in his emotionality, while Dostoevsky, even in his cult of the state, is humanity itself. If you're going to talk like that, said Sokolov, there'll be no room in the official canon for any of the literature of the last century. Far from it, said Mardyarov. What about Tolstoy? He made poetry out of the idea of a people's war, and the state has just proclaimed a people's war. Tolstoy's idea coincides with the interests of the state, and so, as Karimov would say, the magic carpet is whisked in. Now we have Tolstoy on the radio. We have literary evenings devoted to Tolstoy. His works are constantly being reprinted. He even gets quoted by our leaders. Chekhov's done best of all. He was recognized both by the last epoch and by our own, said Sokolov. You've hit the nail on the head, exclaimed Mardyarov, slapping his hand on the table. But if we do recognize Chekhov, it's because we don't understand him. The same as Zoschenko, who's in some ways his disciple. I don't understand, objected Sokolov. Chekhov's a realist. It's the decadence we criticized. You don't understand? Asked Makarov. Well then, I'll explain. Don't you dare say anything against Chekhov, said Maria Ivanovna. He's my favourite writer. And you're quite right, my dear Masha, said Mardyarov. Now, I suppose you, Peter Laurentievich, look to the decadence for an expression of humanity. Sokolov, by now quite angry, gave a dismissive wave of the hand. Mardyarov paid no attention. He needed Sokolov to look to the decadence for humanity. Otherwise he couldn't finish his train of thought. Individualism is not the same as humanity, he explained. Like everyone else, you confuse the two. You think the decadents are much criticized now? Nonsense. They're not subversive of the state, simply irrelevant to it. I'm certain that there's no divide between socialist realism and the decadent movement. People have argued over the definition of socialist realism. It's a mirror. When the party and the government ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" it replies, "You, party. You, government. You, state. You're the fairest of them all." While the decadent's answer to this question is, "Me, me, 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 me. I'm the fairest of them all." Not so very different. Socialist realism is the affirmation of the uniqueness and superiority of the state. The decadent movement is the affirmation of the uniqueness and superiority of the individual. The form may be different, but the essence is one and the same. Ecstatic wonder at one's own superiority. The perfect state has no time for any others that differ from it, and the decadent personality is profoundly indifferent to all other personalities except two. With one of these, it makes refined conversation. With the other, it exchanges kisses and caresses. It may seem that the decadents, with their individualism, are fighting on behalf of man, but not a bit of it. The decadent are indifferent to man. and so is the state. Where's the divide? Sokolov was listening with his eyes half closed. Sensing that Madyarov was about to infringe still more serious taboos, he interrupted, "Excuse me, but what's all this got to do with Chekhov?" "I'm coming to that. Between him and the present day lies a veritable abyss. Chekhov took Russian democracy on his shoulders, the still unrealized Russian democracy. Chekhov's path is the path of Russia's freedom. We took a different path, as Lenin said. Just try and remember all Chekhov's different heroes. Probably only Balzac has ever brought such a mass of different people into the consciousness of society. No, not even Balzac. Just think. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers, lecturers, landlords, shopkeepers, industrialists, nannies, lackeys, students, civil servants of every rank, cattle dealers, tram conductors, marriage brokers, sextons, bishops, peasants, workers, cobblers, artists, models, horticulturalists, zoologists, innkeepers, gamekeepers, prostitutes, fishermen, lieutenants, corporals, artists, cooks, writers, janitors, nuns, soldiers, midwives, prisoners on the Sakhalin Islands. Oh, that's enough! Sokolov finally shouted out. Enough! Repeated Madyarov in a mock, threatening tone of voice. No, that isn't enough. Chekhov brought Russia into our consciousness in all its vastness, with people of every estate, every class, every age. More than that. It was as a democrat that he presented all these people. As a Russian democrat, he said, no one had said this before, not even Tolstoy, that first and foremost, we are all of us human beings. Do you understand? Human beings. He said something no one in Russia had ever said. He said that first of all, we are human beings. And only secondly are we bishops, Russians, shopkeepers, Tartars, workers. Do you understand? Instead of saying that people are good or bad because they're bishops or workers, Tartars or Ukrainians, instead of this, he said that people are equal because they are human beings. At one time, people blinded by party dogma saw Chekhov as a witness to the fin de siècle. No, Chekhov is the bearer of the greatest banner that has been raised in the 1,000 years of Russian history. The banner of a true, humane Russian democracy, of Russian freedom, of the dignity of the Russian man. Our Russian humanism has always been cruel, intolerant sectarianism. From Avakum to Lenin, our conception of humanity and freedom has always been partisan and fanatical. It's always mercilessly sacrificed the individual to some abstract idea of humanity. Even Tolstoy, with his doctrine of non-resistance to evil, is intolerant. And his point of departure is not man, but God. He wants the idea of goodness to triumph. True believers always want to bring God to man by force, and in Russia they stop at nothing, even murder, to achieve this. Chekhov said, let's put God and all these grand progressive ideas to one side. Let's begin with man. Let's be kind and attentive to the individual man, whether he's a bishop, a peasant, an industrial magnate, a convict in the Sakhalin Islands, or a waiter in a restaurant. Let's begin with respect, compassion, and love for the individual, or we'll never get anywhere. That's democracy, the still unrealized democracy of the Russian people. The Russians have seen everything during the last 1,000 years, grandeur and super grandeur, but what they've never seen is democracy. Yes, and this is what separates Chekhov from the decadents. The state may sometimes express irritation with the decadents. It may box them on the ears or kick them up the arse, but it simply doesn't understand Chekhov. That's why it tolerates him. There's still no place in our house for democracy, for a true, humane democracy. It was obvious that Sokolov was very upset by Madyarov's boldness. Noticing this, and with a delight he couldn't quite understand, Victor said, Well said. That's all very true and very intelligent, only I beg you to be indulgent towards Scriabin. He may be a decadent, but I love him." Sokolov's wife offered Victor a saucer of jam. He made a gesture of refusal. "No thanks, not for me." "It's black currant," replied Maria Ivanovna. Victor looked at her golden brown eyes and said, "Have I told you about my weakness, then?" She smiled and nodded her head. Her teeth were uneven and her lips thin and pale. When she smiled, her pallid, even slightly grey face suddenly became quite charming. "She's a splendid woman," thought Victor. "If only her nose wasn't so red." Karimov turned to Madyarov. "Leonid Sergeyevich, how can you reconcile your earlier hymn to Dostoevsky with this passionate speech in praise of Chekhov and his humanity? Dostoevsky certainly doesn't consider everyone equal. Hitler called Tolstoy a degenerate, but they say he has a portrait of Dostoevsky hanging in his office. I belong to a national minority myself. I'm a Tatar who was born in Russia, and I cannot pardon a Russian writer his hatred of Poles and Yids. No, even if he is a genius. We had more than enough blood spilt in Tsarist Russia, more than enough of being spat at in the eye, more than enough pogroms. A great writer in this country has no right to persecute foreigners, to despise Poles and Tatars, Jews, Armenians, and Chuvash." The grey-haired, dark-eyed Tatar smiled haughtily and angrily, like a true Mongol. Still addressing Madyarov, he continued, "Perhaps you've read Tolstoy's Haji Murat. Perhaps you've read The Cossacks. Perhaps you've read the story A Prisoner in the Caucasus. They were written by a Russian count, while Dostoevsky was a Lithuanian. As long as the Tatars remain in existence, they will pray to Allah on behalf of Tolstoy." Victor looked at Karimov, thinking, Well, well, so that's how you feel, is it?" "Akhmet Usmanovich," said Sokolov, "I profoundly respect your love for your people, but allow me to be proud of my nationality too. Allow me to love Tolstoy, and not only because of what he wrote about the Tatars. We Russians, for some reason, are never allowed to be proud of our own people, and if we show such pride, we are immediately taken for members of the Black Hundreds." Karimov got to his feet, his face covered in pearls of sweat. "Let me tell you the truth. Why should I lie when I know the truth? Anyone who remembers how the pride of our race, every cultural figure of any importance, was exterminated way back in the 20s, anyone with a mind can see why the diary of a writer must be banned." "We suffered too," said Artelev. "It wasn't just people who were destroyed, it was a whole culture. Today's intelligentsia are savages by comparison." "Yes," said Madyarov with heavy irony, "but the Tatars might not have stopped at culture. They might have wanted Tatar home rule and Tatar foreign policy, and that's not on." "But you've got your own state now," said Sokolov. "You've got your own institutes, your own schools, your own operas, your own books, you've got newspapers in Tatar, you owe all that to the revolution." "Yes, a state opera, and a comic opera state, but it's Moscow that collects our harvest, and Moscow that sends us to prison." "Would it be any better if you were jailed by a Tatar?" asked Madyarov. "What if people weren't jailed at all?" asked Maria Ivanovna. "Mashenka," said Madyarov, "what will you want next?" He looked at his watch and said, "It's getting on." "Stay for the night, Lenchenka," Maria Ivanovna said hurriedly. "I can make up the camp bed." Madyarovna had once told Maria Ivanovna that he felt particularly lonely late at night, when he came back to a dark, empty room with no one waiting for him. "Well," he said, "I won't say no. Is that all right by you, Pyotr Laventrovich?" "Of course," said the master of the house without the least enthusiasm, Madyarov added with a smile. Everyone got up from the table and began saying goodbye. Sokolov accompanied his guest to the door. Maria Ivanovna lowered her voice and said to Madyarov, It's good that Pyotr Laventreevich no longer shrinks from these conversations. In Moscow he clammed up at the merest hint of anything political. She pronounced her husband's name and patronymic with particular tenderness and respect. At night she often copied out his work by hand. She kept all his notebooks and even pasted his casual jottings onto cards. She thought of him as a great man, and at the same time as her helpless child. "I like Strum," said Madyarov. "I can't understand why people say he's disagreeable." He smiled and added, "I noticed he pronounced all his speeches in your presence, Mashenka. While you were busy in the kitchen, he spared us his eloquence." Maria Ivanovna had turned towards the door. She seemed not to have heard Madyarov. But then she asked, "What do you mean, Lenya? He pays no more attention to me than to an insect. Petya considers him unkind, arrogant, and too ready to mock people. That's why he's not popular, and why some of the physicists are even afraid of him. But I don't agree. I think he's very kind." "That's the last thing I'd say of him," said Madyarov. "He disagrees with everyone and heaps sarcasm on them, but he's got a free mind. He hasn't been indoctrinated." "No, he is kind and vulnerable." "But you have to admit," said Madyarov, "that our Petya doesn't let slip a careless word, even now." Just then Sokolov came into the room. He overheard Madyarov. "I'd like to ask you, Leonid Sergeyevich, first, not to give me advice, and secondly, never again to start conversations of that nature in my presence." "I don't need your advice, for that matter," replied Madyarov. "But just as you answer for your words, I'll answer for mine." Sokolov looked as if he wanted to say something very stinging, but instead he left the room. "Well, perhaps I'd better go home after all," said Madyarov. "You'll make me very upset," said Maria Ivanovna, "and you know how kind he is. It'll torment him all night." She went on to explain that Pyotr Laventreevich had a very sensitive soul, that he suffered a lot, that he'd been interrogated very harshly in 1937, and as a result had had to spend 4 months in a clinic for nervous disorders. Madyarov nodded his head. "All right, Masha, I give in." Then in a sudden fury he added, "That's all very well, but your Petya wasn't the only one to be interrogated. Have you forgotten the 11 months I spent in the Lubyanka? And how during all that time Pyotr only once telephoned my wife Klava, his own sister? Have you forgotten how he forbade you to telephone her? All that hurt Klava very deeply. Yes, your Petya may be a great physicist, but he's got the soul of a lackey." Maria Ivanovna buried her face in her hands and remained silent. Then she said very quietly, No one will ever understand how deeply this pains me." No one else understood how appalled her husband had been by the savagery of general collectivization and the events of 1937. She alone understood his spiritual purity, but then she alone knew how servile he was in the face of power. That was why he was so capricious at home, such a petty tyrant. That was why Masha had to clean his shoes for him, why she had to fan him in hot weather with her headscarf, why she had to keep the mosquitoes off with a branch when they went for walks near their dacha. Once, during his last year at university, Victor had thrown a copy of Pravda onto the floor and said to a fellow student, "It's so deadly boring. How can anyone ever read it?" Immediately afterwards he'd felt terrified. He had picked up the newspaper, smoothed its pages, smiled weakly. Even now, years later, the memory of that pitiful hangdog smile was enough to make him break out into a sweat. A few days later, Victor had held out another issue of Pravda to the same friend and said animatedly, "Grishka, have a look at the leading article. It's good stuff." His friend had taken the newspaper from him and said pityingly, "Vitya's frightened, isn't he? Do you think I'm going to denounce you?" Victor had then taken a vow either to remain silent and not express dangerous thoughts, or else say what he thought without funking it. He had not kept this vow. He had often flared up and thrown caution to the wind, only to suddenly take fright and attempt to snuff out the flame he himself had lit. In 1938, after the trial of Bukharin, he had said to Krimov, "Say what you like, but I've met Bukharin. I've talked to him twice. I remember his kind, intelligent smile. And he's certainly got a head on his shoulders. My impression is that he's someone of great charm and absolute purity." Krimov had looked at him morosely. Thrown into confusion, Victor had muttered, "Oh, but then, who knows? Espionage, working as an agent of the Okhrana. There's nothing charming or pure about that. It's just despicable." Krimov's next words left Victor even more confused. "Since we're relatives," he said sullenly, "let me say one thing to you. I am quite unable, and always shall be unable, to associate the name of Bukharin with the Okhrana." "My God, I can't believe all this horror!" Victor had burst out with sudden fury. "These trials are a nightmare. But why do they confess? Why do they all confess?" Krimov had said nothing more. He'd obviously said too much already. What a wonderful power and clarity there is in speaking one's mind. What a terrible price people paid for a few bold words. How often Victor had lain awake, listening to the cars on the street. Sometimes Lyudmila had gone barefoot to the window and parted the curtains. She'd stayed there for a while and watched. Then, thinking that Victor was asleep, she'd gone silently back to bed and lain down. In the morning she had asked, "Did you sleep well?" "All right, thank you, and you?" "It felt very stuffy. I had to go to the window for some fresh air." "Yes." How can one ever describe those nights and that extraordinary sense of both doom and innocence? "Remember, Victor, every word reaches them. You're destroying yourself together with me and the children." And another time, "I can't tell you everything. But for the love of God, don't say a word to anyone. Victor, we live in a terrible age. You've no idea just how terrible. Remember, not a word to anyone." Sometimes Victor glimpsed the opaque, sad eyes of someone he'd known since childhood. He'd been frightened, not by what his old friend said, but by what he didn't say. And of course he'd been much too frightened to ask directly, "Are you an agent? Do you get called in for questioning?" He remembered looking at his assistant's face after making a thoughtless joke about Stalin's having formulated the laws of gravity long before Newton. "You didn't say anything, and I didn't hear anything," this young assistant had said gaily. Why all these jokes? It was mad to make such jokes, like banging a flask of nitroglycerine with a hammer. What power and clarity lies in the word, in the unfettered, carefree word, the word that's still spoken in spite of all one's fears. Was Victor aware of the hidden tragedy in these conversations? Everyone who took part in them hated German fascism and was terrified of it, but why did they only speak their minds at a time when Russia had been driven back to the Volga, at a time when terrible military defeats held out the threat of slavery? Victor walked silently beside Karimov. "There's something very surprising," he suddenly said, "about novels portraying the foreign intelligentsia. I've just been reading Hemingway. When his characters have a serious conversation, they're always drinking. Cocktails, whiskey, rum, cognac, more cocktails, more cognac, still more different brands of whiskey. Whereas the Russian intelligentsia has always had its important discussions over a glass of tea. The members of People's Will, the populists, the Social Democrats, all came together over glasses of weak tea. Lenin and his friends even planned the revolution over a glass of weak tea, though apparently Stalin prefers cognac." Yes, said Karimov, "you're quite right. And the conversation we had today was over a glass of tea." "Absolutely. And isn't Madyarov intelligent? Isn't he bold? I'm really not used to anyone speaking the way he does. It excites me." Karimov took Victor by the arm. "Victor Pavlovich, Have you noticed that the most innocent remark of Madyarov's somehow sounds like a generalization? I find that worrying. And he was arrested for several months in 1937 and then released, at a time when no one was released. There must be a reason. Do you follow me? Yes, Victor answered slowly, I do. How could I not understand you? You think he's an informer? They parted at the next corner. Victor walked back towards his house. Oh, to hell with it all, he said to himself. At least we've talked like human beings for once, without fear and hypocrisy, saying whatever we felt about her, whatever we liked. Paris is worth a mass. How good that there still were people like Madyarov, people who hadn't lost their independence. Yes, Karimov's warning did strike the usual chill into Victor's heart. Victor realized that he had once again forgotten to tell Sokolov about the letter from the Urals. He walked on down the dark, empty street. Suddenly an idea came to him. Immediately, with his whole being, he knew it was true. He had glimpsed a new and improbable explanation for the atomic phenomena that up until now had seemed so hopelessly inexplicable. Abysses had suddenly changed into bridges. What clarity and simplicity! This idea was astonishingly graceful and beautiful. It seemed to have given birth to itself, like a white water lily appearing out of the calm darkness of a lake. He gasped, revelling in its beauty. And how strange, he thought, suddenly, that this idea should have come to him when his mind was far away from anything to do with science, when the discussions that so excited him were those of free men, when his words, and the words of his friends, had been determined only by freedom, by bitter freedom.